Hello, students. This is Professor Barrett. I want to talk to you now about U.S. intelligence in the era of the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was elected in November 76, sworn in January of 77, defeated for re-election in November of 1980, and so left office in January of 1981. The 1976 presidential campaign was unusual in that intelligence and intelligence related topics like covert action were issues in the presidential campaign. I'm not saying they were the leading issues, but they were issues of significance. Specifically, Jimmy Carter, a former governor of Georgia, charged periodically during his campaigning that CIA seemed to have been out of control, that it was something like a rogue elephant, to use a phrase that was in currency in that time frame. About covert action, Carter said that the US had been too reliant on covert action and that it needed to be seriously reduced. Of course, President Ford disagreed with these critiques, but Ford lost and Carter won. Carter chose a man who had been a classmate of his. Carter had gone to the Naval Academy. Carter had served on submarines. Carter had envisioned being a career Navy man, but when his father died, he and his wife moved back to small town Georgia, Plains, Georgia, and took over the father's peanut farm. Carter entered politics and obviously succeeded in his political career. So he chose Admiral Stansfield Turner to become the new director of Central Intelligence. As I said in a previous lecture, Carter rejected the opportunity to keep George H.W. Bush on as DCI. I have to say, and it's not just me that says this, you can look at the literature on CIA. Stansfield Turner is widely regarded as one of the worst directors in CIA history. He has his defenders, of course, and he has written memoirs and other things to defend his performance. A lot of the controversy has to do with the fact that Turner authorized the firing of personnel from CIA. Now, the study of doing this, plans for doing this stretched back into the period of the previous DCI, but it was Turner who made the final call. And I think you would be shocked if you could see a copy of the letter, the memo that such people received. I'm paraphrasing, but the letter said something like, "Your services are no longer needed at the Central Intelligence Agency." That's about it. Turner would later acknowledge that he should have given more personal attention to the way that people were let go. We're not talking about thousands of people or many, many hundreds of people being laid off at CIA, more like in the number of scores of people. But the way that they were let go and the fact that many of them were in the Directorate of Operations had a chilling effect on morale at the CIA. However, I must add that President Carter, had confidence in his DCI, and he kept Turner on for the entire 4 years. And in his memoirs, I recall reading that Carter wrote that Stansfield Turner had improved morale at the CIA during his tenure there. I don't know of anyone who thinks that other than Jimmy Carter and Stansfield Turner. Turner is one of those intelligence leaders who had far greater faith in what intelligence gathered by technology could do. He was way more of an enthusiast for the satellites, for example, that were launched. Not that CIA itself was launching satellites, that was done by the National Reconnaissance Office. But of course, Central Intelligence Agency is just that, a central or centralizing intelligence agency, so it and some other agencies could draw on the photo intelligence and related other kinds of intelligence that the satellites and other technologies could gather. So there lay his enthusiasm with technical intelligence, not human intelligence, which he thought was overrated. Let's talk about a few events during the Carter era. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. As you can see, Afghanistan was on the southern border of the Soviet Union. There had been instability in Afghanistan. There had been apparently growing anti-Soviet sentiment in government circles of Afghanistan. The Soviets actually, I'm summarizing and simplifying the history a bit, but the Soviets had been responsible for bringing into power a leader who was supposed to be more safely pro-Soviet, or at least not anti-Soviet. The Soviets were not pleased with the results of that, so at a certain point, they sent in tanks and troops and installed another utterly pro-Soviet government. Again, this occurred in December 1979, with just over a year to go in the Carter presidency. I revisited the literature on this topic before doing this lecture for you, because I wanted to see what people are saying about whether or not this was an intelligence failure for the US. And I looked at what seems to be a carefully done in-house study by the CIA itself, which concludes that, yes, this was an intelligence failure. When I read about it, it reminded me of the intelligence failure at CIA and most other agencies in late summer 1962, when they concluded that the Soviets would not put nuclear-armed missiles into Cuba that could strike the US. And the main reason behind that analysis in 1962 is it would be uncharacteristic of the Soviet Union to do such a thing. Well, jump ahead to 1979, and a similar conclusion was reached. Yes, the Soviets had the capability to invade and take over Afghanistan, but it would be out of character for them to do that sort of thing. Obviously, I'm summarizing briefly, but if you Google CIA, intelligence failure, Soviet Union, Afghanistan, those sorts of words, you'll find the study that I am talking about. Certainly, policymakers, including the president and others, felt utterly surprised by what the Soviets did. And this study confirms that indeed it was an intelligence failure. Jimmy Carter took a tremendous beating in terms of public opinion for admitting, and he sounded naive when he admitted it. He said something like, I was completely surprised and disappointed by what the Soviets did. So critics said that Carter was simply naive. Well, a month earlier, November 1979, there was another event that was intelligence related and was very widely perceived as a failure on the part of President Carter, but perceived by many as also a failure of US intelligence. In Iran, there had been a lot of instability in Iran in the previous year or so. The Shah of Iran, you might recall me and a couple of one or two student presentations talking about CIA working with the British, installing a pro-American, pro-British government with a coup in 1953, the new government of Iran headed by the Shah, S-H-A-H, that was his title, the Shah of Iran. Well, he remained in power and was generally pro-American across those years. Iran became a big US intelligence asset for our technologies and in terms of some human intelligence capabilities. But there was growing Islamic fundamentalist opposition to the Shah's government, which was a very repressive government. It was overthrown, and eventually a new government came into power, and students and others broke into the US embassy in Tehran, Iran. This, of course, was a gross violation of international law because an embassy of a country is considered to be the territory of the home country. So by international law, the Iranians had no right to break into the embassy, but they did, and they took scores of Americans hostage, and most of them, not all, some were released, but most were held hostage for the next year and a couple of months. A friend of mine, I didn't know him back then, but he was a young, new CIA officer, and his first assignment abroad and working for the Directorate of Operations was Iran. So he was among others that were captured. He did not admit to being a CIA officer. He had diplomatic cover. Americans in the embassy shredded documents, but Iranians spent a lot of time and effort putting together those shredded documents, and they were able to identify him as a CIA officer. So he was held captive in solitary confinement and tortured off and on for much of that year and a couple of months. The amazing thing about this guy, who is now retired and teaches at a college in the South, he's a very happy-go-lucky kind of a guy. How he manages to be that way, I don't know. The Americans would be held hostage through January of 1980. The US election in January of 81, they would be held until then. The election, presidential election, November 1980, came on almost exactly the 1-year anniversary of the taking of the Americans as hostage in Iran. Not good for President Carter's re-election prospects. I think you're probably all aware that a movie came out, seems like it was about, 5 or 6 years ago, called Argo, the story of the US and the CIA getting some Americans out of Iran. It's a very good movie, a very successful movie, nominated for a number of Academy Awards. Jimmy Carter was really never a fan of the CIA. And so I'm not going to go to this YouTube link right now, but you can. I think you'll enjoy it. On the very day that the Academy Awards were being held, Carter was speaking to an organization in California, I think San Francisco, and someone asked him, so what do you think about this movie Argo and its accuracy? And you'll see, he says, and he's pretty much right, that the movie is not historically accurate because it gives way too little credit to the Canadian government and the Canadian embassy and other sort of Canadian personnel. CIA certainly played a role in getting those Americans out of Iran, but the Canadians seem to have played a bigger role. Well, let's talk about something happier. The most significant positive foreign policy event of the Carter presidency, the so-called Camp David Peace Accords of 1978. In this photo, you see President Carter. He's at the presidential retreat, Camp David. There on the left is Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, and on the right, Menachem Begin, the leader of Israel. This was a very bold initiative by President Carter and the US government to bring together the leaders of Egypt and Israel, which were technically still in a state of war. The two nations had fought active wars periodically, off and on, for decades, never had a true peace treaty, much less diplomatic relations. Carter brought together those leaders and worked out, well, among other things, a peace agreement between the two nations, diplomatic relations between the two nations. The Camp David Accords had a sort of a framework for achieving resolution of the Palestinian question, as it was called. That, of course, has never been achieved. Still, the Camp David Accords were significant. Again, in preparation for this lecture, I looked back to see what has President Carter said, former President Carter said, about whether or not CIA was helpful to him in the lead up to and during those meetings at Camp David. And he says, you can see the quote. I rarely read quotes to you when you can see them, but I'm going to do it this time. Carter noted that he asked CIA and the intelligence community to prepare briefings on both Begin and Sadat that addressed a number of key questions, including exploring the characters that permitted them to become leaders, the basic root of their ambition to become leaders, their basic goals in life, key childhood events, religious beliefs, family relationships, relationships with other leaders around the world. CIA, in Carter's estimation, was very helpful to him in successfully negotiating with two men who actually despised and distrusted one another, Begin and Sadat. Now, in the larger US government, other things were going on, and specifically I have in mind Congress. By 1977, the first year of Carter's presidency, both the Senate and the House had fully functioning intelligence committees. They're not small committees. These days, and the size would be the same back then, something like 15 members of the Senate, in the House, something like 19 members. The numbers go up and down a little bit across the years, but they're not, it's not like those small subcommittees that you read about in the CIA and Congress. So significant size committees with a legal right to know almost everything going on with the intelligence agencies, large staffs to assist those committees. It was a sea change from what you read about in the CIA and Congress. Also in the Carter era, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It created the so-called FISA court, placing legal limits on what the National Security Agency could do. Especially of concern was trying to prevent NSA from listening to, from monitoring communications in which American citizens especially were party to those communications. Carter was okay with that, but I have to say many conservatives were not. Now I show you Ronald Reagan. In 1980, when he ran against President Carter, intelligence was again a significant issue. Reagan said, we need to unleash the CIA, and we need to be aggressive in using the agency around the world. Reagan did not become explicit about covert action and human gathering of intelligence, but people who were paying attention knew what he meant. The wraps would come off of CIA if Reagan, and the wraps would come off of US intelligence, CIA, NSA, and others if Reagan were to be elected president, and he was.